So this sort of happens. What people don't know is that if you want to talk about unbelievably corrupt police departments, New Orleans is your city.
New Orleans police had a lot of issues with civil rights violations going back decades. Some very celebrated and troubling cases even before this. What's also striking is even years after the shootings on the bridge, and there were other police horrors as well, the Department of Justice issued a really detailed report looking at the breakdowns in policies and practices in the New Orleans Police Department.
Well, in fact, it was New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu, when he became mayor, who called in the Justice Department to examine the police department.
That was part of it. Initially, Mayor Landrieu signed a consent decree which mandated changes in policies and protocols in the department. Later on, he tried to back out of that decree. I think one of the lessons that I think I learned from this is, remember, in this case, not only was there a shooting of these residents that killed 2 and maimed 4, there was a cover-up that began right away.
Right. So let's talk about that, because so you have this shooting that takes place, and then all of a sudden, cops get on the scene. They realize what happened. Then it's, uh-oh.
On the top of the bridge, even before all the victims were tended to, there was talk about planting a gun. And in the coming days and weeks and months, the police planted the gun, alleging it was Lance Madison's. Now think about that. Lance, a 49-year-old man at the time, one-time professional football player, he stayed back to watch over his younger brother. His younger brother died on that bridge in a horrific fashion. Police then charged him with attempted murder. He spent 25 days in jail.
So wait a minute. So was Lance on the bridge?
Lance was there as well, yes.
Okay, so Lance was on the bridge, and they decided to plant a gun and say he was trying to come after them. He was trying to shoot them.
The police story, and it really was a story, was that the residents were shooting first. The truth is the residents were unarmed. The residents were not shooting at anyone. So as far as the cover-up goes, it was a planting of a gun, and it was pretty severe the length the cover-up went. At one point, some supervisors were in office trying to write a report justifying their actions, and one of the supervisors said, "Give me a name." And one of his colleagues just yelled out the name Lakeisha. So the supervisor then wrote a report. Lakeisha Smith is a witness to this and saw the Madisons with guns. It was a fiction. It was a fiction, like much of that report that the police filed.
Wow. And so how does it all unravel?
That's a great question. Really, in tracing the history of this, and sadly, it's a 10-year history because, as you mentioned, the case is ongoing. It really was the families pushing for answers. The police narrative was simple. This was a horrible thing that happened during Katrina. We were responding to gunfire. We acted appropriately. That was the police line. And each wall really of lies to get to the truth. And about a year after the shootings, the families, led by the Madisons, also the Bartholomew's, Jose Holmes, and later J.J. Brissett's mom, all filed lawsuits contending that there was a whole different story here, that these were, in fact, families trying to survive.
See, this is a perfect example, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, of what people are talking about with this Black Lives Matter movement. That in this country, if the cops say it happened, we believe them. That we give them absolute discretion and authority. In this case, they lie, they cover up, they make things up, and unfortunately, the repercussions are not there. And so I'm going to get to the trial in a little bit, and then, of course, moving up to where we are now. But as it's uncovered all these lies, what happens to these sergeants? What happens to these supervisors? Do they quickly retire and they get their pensions? Or does somebody go after their pensions because they flat out just lied?
Well, there's a long story to that. But first, let me mention, one of the things you mentioned, Roland, is that I interviewed Mark Morial, the former mayor of New Orleans, of course, president of the National Urban League. He was a mayor in New Orleans at a time when he hired an outsider as police chief, an outsider who wasn't friends with the officers, so he respected the force and respected the good officers, but it was tough on discipline. And I saw how important it is to have tough leadership at the top. In New Orleans, in Katrina, the mayor, Ray Nagin, had never held elected office before, and I think there was a sense that the police could patrol as they wanted to. That was really important. As far as the officers are involved, one thing Mark Morial said to me was, in order to convict a police officer, it's not reasonable doubt. You have to convict them beyond all doubt. He thought that from watching this case and others. In this case, there was a long road to justice. After the families filed a lawsuit, initially the local DA, Eddie Jordan, brought charges in state court. But those charges quickly unraveled. They fell apart. And
how? I mean, that's what I don't understand. How? I mean, that's what you're supposed to do.
Well, there were a couple of things. Then one of the things that's really striking about this is the family's response. When the case went to state court, the judge overseeing the case, several of the clerks in his office have had relationships with lawyers from the defense. Now, to the judge's credit, he disclosed that as he's supposed
right.
to. But the DA didn't initially try to remove him from hearing this case.
Are you serious?
It took many months before they did. That's right. Another issue is that the judge gave a bond to the officers accused in this case. And again, I got to say that the DA didn't object. When the officers, initially there were 7 officers charged and 7 shooters. We didn't have the supervisors involved in the cover-up yet. And I should mention that the state case was really about the shooting. When the officers went to their first court appearance in the beginning of 2007, they were literally paraded as heroes in the streets. There were signs held up that said heroes. A year or so later, the judge dismissed the case. He cited prosecutorial error. He said that the prosecution made some mistakes, improperly disclosed some evidence. He threw the case out. But what's really striking is that even while that case was pending, while it was still active, the Madison family in particular didn't trust the atmosphere in New Orleans to right this wrong. They wrote to the Department of Justice and asked the DOJ Civil Rights Division to come in. Mark Morial was among those as well. So later on, after the state case fell apart, the Civil Rights Division came in, and I think the evidence is clear, did a much more intensive investigation getting to the bottom of this.
So DOJ comes in, federal civil rights investigation. The problem there is that because it's not a state case, they're not charged with murder. They're not charged with attempted murder. They have to be charged with violating the civil rights of the individuals who were involved. And so now we go to a civil trial. They get tried. How many are tried? How many are convicted?
A couple things on the DOJ case. You're right. It was largely a civil rights case, but it was a criminal case. It was a civil rights criminal case. And I think that the charges were significant. In the context, the charges were significant. I will mention that the Department of Justice, I think they went well beyond what the DA was investigating. They closed down the bridge 4 years later and searched for evidence. They knocked on doors of witnesses who had never been interviewed before, and they pierced the wall of silence.
Gotcha.
They got a couple of supervisors and a couple of the shooters to enter guilty pleas and testify.
Hold tight 1 second. We're going to a break, folks. A stunning story. You want to get this book. It's called Shots on the Bridge, Police Violence and Cover-Up in the Wake of Katrina by Ronnie Greene. We'll be back at the Roland Martin Show in a moment. Yeah, unbelievable.
It's such a compelling case. The thing that still gets me is 10 years later, the families may have to go through this again.
It's like, but this is precisely this is precisely the point that I keep trying to explain to people. When you have these where judges, clerks, cops, DAs, they are all in that system. So they are all insiders of a system. And if you're an outsider, the citizens are outsiders. And that system, frankly, protects one another.
It's one of the things that keeps coming up to me, and I mentioned a couple of times, is like it took the families pushing so hard. And the Madison family, I mean, look at this. It's an incredible family. Researching 10 kids were born. You know, a couple of the kids died early in life from tragic events. And you have Ronald, who they looked after, lovingly. He shot dead in the bridge. They had the wherewithal to know that the DA case was going nowhere. The fact that they asked for the DOJ to come in, even when it was active, shows you that. And what if it wasn't? What if the Madison family wasn't involved?
Oh, please. But this goes to, just like you have these cases where people they say, yeah, we don't trust the DA. We don't trust they're going to do it. I mean, that's what I was talking to Attorney Ben Crump. We were talking about this here. And he was saying the exact same thing, why it's important for the family to pursue their own case, because they can actually force evidence coming out.
That's right. That's what happened in this case. Absolutely.
Unbelievable. Let's just tweet out so folks can hear us. Yeah, man. New Orleans, that police department. Oh. Poorly paid and they've had problems for years.
They have, yeah. Many high-profile cases, troubling cases, and there are other ones, of course, in between as well. But I think, the leadership backing is pretty striking too. I mean, these guys were. There was a quote. One of the quotes in the books is, the officers were survivors in some ways, like the residents. I mean, they were not having. I mean, it was beyond difficult. There's a quote from a supervisor that said some officers who should have been decommissioned in Central County were instead handed high-powered rifles and told to patrol. It was really toxic environment.
That was crazy. Oh, I remember, because who was the guy?
The chief?
Oh hell, he damn near had a mental. He basically had a mental breakdown.
Yeah, there was no real leadership of the police. They were sort of on their own, and they were.
Because the chief was the one who I remember did the interview talking about, watching all this mayhem in the Superdome that didn't even exist.
That's right.
It's like, dude, what are you talking about?
Yeah, and he resigned shortly after.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the Roland Martin Show. The whole week we are focused on Hurricane Katrina. We're talking about what happened then, a look back at what's going on. And this story we're talking about right now is one of the most egregious stories that took place 10 years ago, but unfortunately still is in the news today. Ronnie Greene wrote this book. It's called Shots on the Bridge, Police Violence and Cover Up in the Wake of Katrina. How long did you work on this story?
I first started looking at the story 4 years ago.
And why? Why?
Sure. I happened to read a wire story from the Associated Press about the officers in this case being convicted in federal court. And I was reading that story in my newsroom in D.C. in August of 2011, and the facts of the case stopped me in my tracks. I read a little bit about Ronald Madison, who was shot in the back. I read a little bit about J.J. Brissett, the 17-year-old who died as well. I read about the cover-up. And I instantly wanted to try to find out how and why these residents and the police officers converged that day. Of course, Katrina was a factor of it. How and why they were brought together by nature and fate. As I looked into it, Roland, the more I looked into it, the more painful and in many ways poignant the story became.
I asked every author this question, and I'll ask you this. Give me one or two things that served as the wow moment for you. That just caught, here you are, investigative reporter, you've been covering in the news for years, and you're researching this story, then you just go, what? Wow. What was that wow moment?
There were a couple of them. One is the pain and trauma on that bridge. There were one moment that stood out for me is Susan Bartholomew, the mother of the Bartholomew family. She was shot in the arm. Her arm had to be amputated. It was dangling by a thread. As the bullets were flying, her 17-year-old daughter, Alicia, lay atop her mother to try to protect her. That was such a heartbreaking and powerful moment. Of course, Alicia lay atop her mom. Bullets kept coming. Alicia had to go through life-saving surgery. Their family's nephew, Jose Holmes, also had to go through life-saving surgery.
And the cops were using what, assault rifles?
A mix of police-issued guns and assault rifles. That's right. Some of their own AK-47s. They had their own weaponry. So one of the tragic moments was really what happened at that bridge. The other moment, among many moments that raised my eyebrows, was really the extent of the cover-up. The lengths to which the police would go. As one of the officers who testified in court said, essentially, we would make up lies whenever we needed to make the story hold. And at the end of those lies were two families who were just trying to survive and deserved none of this.
The DOJ prosecutes. They get how many officers won trial?
5 officers went to trial.
So initially there were 7. What happened to the other 2?
That's a good question. Initially in state court there were 7, only the shooters. When the DOJ got involved, they got a much more detailed investigation that led to supervisors involved in the cover-up. So the number of officers charged actually grew beyond that. It grew to 11. 5 entered guilty pleas. 1 is yet to be tried, a supervisor. 5 went to trial. And that's the case I focused on. The 5 went to trial.
Okay, so let's go back. So there were 7 shooters. How many officers went to trial? So 5 officers who were of the 7 shooters were on trial in federal court?
Let me clarify. So there were really 11 main officers involved, 7 shooters and 4 supervisors. 5 of the officers involved had pleaded guilty. 2 of those,
including shooters.
2 shooters.
Got it.
Sorry, 2 supervisors and 3 shooters.
Okay.
At trial, were 4 of the officers who spilled out of that truck and a supervisor who arrived on scene shortly after.
Okay.
So in August of 2011, that first story that I read, the officers were convicted of nearly every count by a federal jury in New Orleans. And honestly, looking back over the 10-year arc of this story, that seems to be the one moment where there was relief by families.
Right.
The victim families were crying outside the courthouse. When the Madison family stepped outside, they were embraced by friends and neighbors. This was the one moment where they felt justice was served, but it really wasn't served because 2 years later, the judge in this case vacated those jury verdicts.
Why? So first of all, what year was that trial?
The case was tried in 2011.
Trial 2011. 2 years later, 2013,
right.
The decision thrown out. Why?
That's one of the many, many striking things about this case. The decision was thrown out largely because of anonymous comments some prosecutors in the DOJ office in New Orleans have been making. Basically, whenever the New Orleans Times-Picayune wrote a story about police misconduct, a couple of prosecutors would write comments anonymously in the bottom of the story.
Now, I remember when that happened. And it was stunning because that also impacted some other cases that were going on. But these prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office, were they involved in this prosecution?
Well, the main writer was not involved in this case at all. No, but he was an opiner on many cases in New Orleans. The other main writer was not a prosecutor on this case, although she was later asked to look into the DOJ actions in this case. There was some overlap there. And what the defense was arguing was these anonymous comments they felt were part of a campaign, an orchestrated campaign by the Department of Justice to essentially convict the officers before they went into court, which even the judge early on admitted was a long shot. Ultimately, the judge overturned the jury verdicts in large measure because of that, which is striking on so many levels.
Well, a federal judge there in New Orleans?
The judge who oversaw the case.
Okay.
Kurt Engelhardt, who oversaw the case, ordered a new trial largely because of these anonymous comments. Think about it. Those comments had nothing to do with the events of September 4, 2005, nothing to do. If they now have heavily factored into likely a new retrial.
Okay, so wasn't there recent court action regarding this case?
There was. The appeals court in Louisiana took up this case. The DOJ came back and said, yes, the actions of those prosecutors were dead wrong. Totally inappropriate to be commenting on stories, even anonymously or not. But they argued those comments had nothing to do with this case. And there's no evidence, none whatsoever, that jurors ever saw or would ever care about these anonymous comments.
And the appeals court ruled.
2-1 ruling reaffirmed the judge's decision, setting the way for a new trial. Now, the Department of Justice has another potential avenue or two to try to appeal, and they may well do that. Arguing the significance of this case, they may try to take their argument before the full appeals court for the state of Louisiana.
So first of all, let's go back to those who pled guilty.
Sure.
How many years did they get? Anybody go to prison? How long?
They did. The officers who pleaded guilty got a range. The officer who was driving the truck and fired his gun, now his bullets didn't hit any of the victims. He pleaded guilty, told harrowing stories. He got an 8-year prison sentence. Other officers got 6 years, 6.5 years. All 5 who pleaded guilty got prison sentences.
So for the family, there's been partial justice.
Well, one of the things the family said, the families showed up at every one of these court hearings.
Mm-hmm.
Sherelle Johnson, JJ's mom showed up. The Madison family showed up. Lance Madison showed up. One of the things they said when one of the officers who pleaded guilty, they said, we're glad that he told the truth, but we really wish somebody would have spoken the truth from the beginning. If one of these officers, just one, had spoken the truth from the beginning, Lance Madison would have never been held behind bars. Think about that. His brother is gunned down before him. He's held behind bars on phony charges. So the families had a little bit of justice, but it was hard-fought justice. Then the real justice came when those officers who went to trial were convicted and they were sentenced. Those sentences went up to 65 years.
Really?
Significant sentences. The highest offense, that's also striking. There were so many tragedies in this case. The officer, about 65 years, his name is Robert Falcone Jr., he came from a military background. He had never fired his weapon on duty before. His father was a minister, came from a really good family. But his actions that day led to him getting a 65-year sentence. And as the storm was coming, Mr. Falcone's fiancée was 9 months pregnant. He could have tried to beg off. He gave her keys to his car, sent her to higher ground, and went to duty. But the times and the turmoil were such that all the officers in that truck who fired first and didn't ask questions.
Who's footing their legal defense? The police union?
Early on, the police unions did have some fundraisers to help with the defense, and I imagine that's the case. I haven't followed up on that. They have all the officers, of course, have lawyers, and lawyers working on the appeal as well.
So, if the DOJ appeals, then it'll go up, and then it might even go up to the Supreme Court. They likely may have to just go and have another trial.
Well, there's two possible outcomes: another trial or
plea bargains.
Well, that's a third. That's a third option. You're exactly right. The two immediate options are a retrial, which is where it's heading right now. If an appeals court overturns these earlier verdicts and reinstates the verdicts, then that's the same. In between, you're right. There's always the possibility of negotiation. I have no idea where that's going to go. Right now, everyone's waiting to see if the DOJ is going to formally challenge that 2-1 decision.
What is still, first of all, how does this still grip New Orleans? Because here you have a city that I won't say they're trying to forget. I won't say they're trying to move on. But I do think there's sort of this effort to say we've moved beyond people have Congressman Jefferson, Governor Blanco out of office. So a lot of things have changed. This still, to me, seems like there's a cloud hanging over New Orleans, as if this is unfinished business.
That's a good point. One of the things I noticed, one of my earlier reporting trips was in April 2012 when those 5 officers were sentenced, those prison sentences. I went into New Orleans to attend that sentencing to see it happen. One of the things that struck me when I walked in, as the police officers walked into the courtroom, one side of the courtroom stood up in respect for the officers. That was the officers' friends and family. The other side, which was the victims' friends and family, stayed in their seats. So there was still this division that was just very obvious seeing then. I'm not sure anyone who wants to see this case retried again. I do know that many in the community were happy after the verdicts came in back in 2011. The lead prosecutor in the case was stopped on the streets by residents who thanked her for bringing this case to light, for getting justice.
Hold tight 1 second. We're going to finish the last part of our interview with Ronnie Greene, author of Shots on the Bridge of the Roland Martin Show, back in a moment. Be our final segment.
Okay.
Oh man, this case is crazy.
It is.
But again, see, and this is why I try to explain to people who don't understand the distrust of the legal system.
Yeah.
Who don't understand the distrust of police departments.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. I mean, these are folks who are saying, man, I can't trust this. You know, they're supposed to be, prosecutors are supposed to do the right thing. They're supposed to be on the side of the people. You know, then you got these games folks play.
You know what's really interesting, Owen, is the Madison family was close to police. Their brother, who was a dentist, treated police officers as patients, including one of the officers from that truck.
Wow.
One of the sisters had married a police officer. Ronald, who was the mentally disabled son they all cared over, the family had to meet Officer Friendly. One of the things Lance said, so they're on this bridge, the police pull up in a budget truck, they have no idea it's the police, obviously.
Right.
Lance later said, if he knew it was police, he would have never run, and he would have been shot dead. Because the family had a trust in police. They knew police. They were so stunned by this.
That's unbelievable. That place was, you had people, man, who had no business being on the streets. They were traumatized, the city was traumatized, and they were, well, then that's when because you got all those crazy false reports. Like, people still believe there was raping going on in the Superdome and all kind of craziness.
Right.
It's never been proven.
That's right. One other thing I'll say, though, and I heard this from the police side, is you're right. A lot of those stories were phony. At that time, no one knew they were phony. It was like there was so much hype, you didn't know what was true, what was false.
Yep. Well, that's what I'm saying, because it was the police chief who repeated
one of those stories. So people, when he said it, folks went, "Oh, gotta be true."
It gives you credibility. That's right.
And then later he had to come back and, nah, that wasn't. That was an unbelievable period. Unbelievable. Straight out. Oh, it's okay. So they say justice or just us. All right, what we got? Coming right back in about 30 seconds. Here we go. Folks, welcome back to the Roland Martin Show. We are continuing our conversation. Our final segment with my guest, Ronnie Greene, is the author of the book, Shots on the Bridge, Police Violence and Cover-Up in the Wake of Katrina. Ronnie, you've been a reporter for how long?
More than 2 decades.
You've covered many stories. In covering this story, has it, I won't say has it changed your mind, I won't say has it shed new light, but has it caused you to look at the Eric Garner case, look at the John Crawford case, the Victor White case, the Michael Brown? Has it caused you to look at all of these cases in a different way?
Well, let me try to tackle that a different way if I can, because I started looking into this case, as I mentioned, in August of 2011. And all those cases, many of them occurred in 2014 and 2015. And they have prompted what I feel is like a new civil rights movement across this country. There's no question. I, of course, paid very close attention to those cases. The Walter Scott case, the images of him falling down, that stopped me in my tracks, just like this case did. Those cases were haunting, they were tragic. And in a lot of those cases started with the most innocent of moments. Someone didn't have their tags, or the taillights are out. And it ends with someone being shot dead.
And of course, in the Walter Scott case, the cop lied about his actions. The other cop corroborated what he had to say. Same thing in the Sam DuBose case. And so, again, it sort of reveals this police culture of protect and serve, but really protect and serve ourselves, not the public.
Well, as I was looking at those cases, I kept thinking back to the Danziger case. And what I thought was, when you look at both the trauma and the bloodshed on that small bridge, coupled with the extensive cover-up, it really, I think, marks as one of the more significant civil rights abuse cases that we've seen because of the combination of those two, the trauma and the cover-up. And one thing as a journalist that I always try to do is I try to do justice to stories. I try to get to the bottom of stories, learn as much as I can. And in many ways, I felt like this Shots on the Bridge is the most important story I've ever chased because of those issues, because of the significant civil rights issues. A couple of things I learned along the way, I think, is one of the things this case study shows, this painful case study, is how important leadership is at the top. You know, the department at this time of unprecedented chaos, bodies in the street, saving survivors, craziness happening, there was real leadership back here. As one of the supervisors, not involved in this case, supervisors and department leader wrote, these officers, were left to fend for themselves. Some officers who should have been decommissioned and sent for counseling were instead handled high-powered rifles and told to patrol. That was the environment that they were working in. So I really try to keep that in mind as well. This was a time of significant seriousness and chaos, and I try to keep that in mind. But at the end of the day, the victims in this case were guilty of nothing more than trying to survive the hurricane.
The other thing I think that
what this case yells out dovetails perfectly with the demands of Black Lives Matters activists. Why you have to have an independent prosecutor? Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York has signed that executive order. Any cases of a fatal shooting involving a cop, the state attorney general investigates. We just had the case of Wesley Carrick, the officer, shot and killed Jonathan Farrell. 3 cops come on the scene. 2 cops pull their tasers out. He pulls his gun out, fires 12 shots. Jonathan Farrell is hit 10 times. The jury deadlocks 8-4. And I understand it was 8-4 for acquittal. The first DA took it to a grand jury, couldn't get an indictment. He recused himself. The state attorney general took over. They were able to get an indictment. And so even in this case, it screams to me why having an independent prosecutor is important, because you are not tied to that incestuous local law enforcement community.
It was very relevant in this case, and that's exactly what happened in this case. Remember, when the state DA case was active, the Madison family and others didn't trust the local system to right the wrong. They felt the atmosphere was stacked against them. So in this case, it took an outsider, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division based in D.C., working with agents and prosecutors based in New Orleans, basically outsiders to crack this case to the level that it did. And the families didn't feel comfortable until they felt that there were those forces looking into this.
When you look at these families, and this is the piece I think a lot of people don't understand, they've been footing the bill for their own attorneys for a decade.
One of the many outrages of justice delayed in this case is, remember, it was the families who first brought a whole new narrative to the story. In 2006, a year later, when they filed lawsuits saying, here's the real story. Those lawsuits, once a criminal case was filed, those civil lawsuits were put on hold. Because the criminal case, 10 years later, is still active, the families have never had their day in court, civil court. Those cases are still pending, which is striking.
Wow. Because normally, by this time, there would have been a civil case or some type of settlement.
That's right.
So criminal has been going on for 10 years, and they're still waiting for civil.
As one of the lawyers, Edwin Shorty, the lawyer for the Bartholomew family, I asked him about his thoughts about, family's thoughts about this long road to justice. And what he said was, essentially, how much justice do you expect when you get shot at by police? I thought that was a very striking comment.
These have, of the family members who were injured, all still alive?
Yes.
Any have lingering health issues?
Well, Susan Bartholomew had her arm amputated.
Right.
This is something that will stay with her for her whole life. Jose Holmes, I haven't talked about a whole lot. He's a 19-year-old. He's Susan's nephew. He was left for dead. Paramedics saw him and thought he was dead, and Jose somehow on that bridge whispered, "Don't give up on me." He went through rounds and rounds and rounds of surgery that saved his life. As one family member told me, it was as if Jose went to the other side and came back. His life will forever be changed because of what he went through, all the surgeries he went through. And then there's also the emotional scars. Alicia Bartholomew, who lay atop her mom as the bullets kept tearing in, she'll never get past those images of hearing her mom and dad scream. Lance Madison, who tried to protect his brother, had to make the wrenching choice to try to get help for Ronald as he saw Ronald was bleeding. He'll never, I mean, how could you ever get over that? And then also Sherelle Johnson, the mother of JJ, her 17-year-old boy, her pride and joy. She wakes up every morning to a house without JJ. Those scars are profound. You can't even describe those scars.
Did any of the officers who pled guilty, did they apologize to the family?
There were, yes. One of the officers, a couple of them did. One of the officers who pled guilty said he felt ashamed to be part of such an infamous moment in New Orleans history. He apologized to all the families. That was the hearing where the family stood up, the Madison family stood up in court and said, "We appreciate this officer's name is Ignatius Hills telling the truth now, but we wish someone would have said that from the first day. Lance may never have been charged." I mean, think about it. Lance spent 25 days in jail. He was held initially at basically a prison camp for Hurricane Katrina criminals. He stood with his back to the wall the whole time. He was afraid someone would try to kill him. This is what he went through in these days after this traumatic event.
Did the city ever apologize to this family?
That's a good question. The city ultimately agreed with the consent decree that the DOJ signed, which is a form of saying we agree that things need to be changed in New Orleans, then tried to back out. And the family's lawyers will tell you, these cases are still pending. That speaks for itself. Their cases are still pending in the civil court.
The officers who pled guilty went to prison. Are they all out?
One is out that I know of. One of the supervisors who wasn't involved in any shooting but was involved in the cover-up, he got the shortest sentence. He got 3 years, so he is out. But the other 4 officers who pled guilty are still serving time, have a little bit of time left on. So in some cases, a little bit of time, some cases several years. The officers who went to trial and were convicted, they remain in prison. The shooters remain in prison while the case is on appeal.
So the officers who were convicted in federal court,
yes,
and it's been overturned, and the DOJ is appealing. Those cops are in jail.
The shooters remain in prison still. They're serving their terms. But the one supervisor with the 5 defendants, he's out on bond during these appeals.
So he's the only one of those who were convicted.
That's right.
He's the only one. So the person who was sentenced to 65 years in prison, he's in prison.
Yes, sir. He's still in prison. That's right.
Gotcha. So if this thing goes all the way, and let's just say something crazy happens, and it is the convictions are totally thrown out, or even if they're allowed to stay in, they will have time served.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential turns that this case could take, and a case that's taken already many surprising turns, not the least of which was the judge's ruling. The outcomes are still to be dictated. We don't know what's going to happen. Whether there will be another trial or not really is a profound question.
It is a stunning story. The detail in the book called Shots on the Bridge, Police Violence and Cover-Up in the Wake of Katrina, by Ronnie Greene. Folks, you want to get this book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, take your pick. Ronnie, we appreciate it. Just a phenomenal book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, folks. Thank you so very much, sir. We come back more with the Roland Martin Show in a moment.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Good
I
questions.
appreciate it. Thank you. Thank
it.
you. Oh, let me get a pen. You can sign that for me.
I'd be happy to.
Oh, man. Well, thank goodness they're still in prison. They didn't let them out while it was being appealed. That probably be even more painful for the family.
One of Lance's lawyers told me that when that news broke, he was really worried they were going to get out.
Yep.
He was really worried they were going to get out.
Ooh. I can only imagine. He was walking across the bridge trying to be safe. All righty. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed our talk.
Thanks a bunch. Thank you. Good luck with the book. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
All righty. Is that crazy or what, y'all? That is crazy, yo. Crazy. All right, I'm starting a new Periscope. Do do do.